It is January 1875 in the unforgiving Medicine Bow Valley of the Wyoming Territory, and the White Death has arrived. Outside, the temperature has plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, and a screaming wind is tearing the shingles right off the arrogant, stick-frame houses of the local ranch hands. But deep inside the side of a hill, 16-year-old Lily Harper is perfectly calm. As the blizzard rages against the glass, she simply feeds another log into her stove, the warmth enveloping her and her sway-backed mule, Barnaby, in a sanctuary of silence. While grown men are freezing in cabins that leak like sieves, Lily is safe. But to understand how a teenage girl outsmarted the deadliest winter in history, we have to go back just 4 months earlier, to a kitchen in Kansas, where she was handed $50 and told to get out. The year was 1874. The air in the cramped farmhouse smelled of stale grease and despair. Outside, the Kansas wind howled, threatening to strip the paint right off the wood, but the storm inside was far worse. Lily's stepmother, a woman with eyes as hard as flint and a belly swollen with a new child, slammed a wooden spoon onto the table. "Look around, girl," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This farm is bleeding dry. We got another mouth to feed come winter, and I won't have a useless eater taking bread from my own." She leaned in, her smile devoid of warmth. "Silas Vance wants a wife. He's offered a handsome dowry. You'll marry him, or you'll starve." Lily's stomach churned. Silas Vance was a 60-year-old horsebreaker with knuckles like walnuts and a reputation for using his belt on anything that disobeyed him, be it beast or bride. He was wealthy by local standards, but his soul was rot. "I'd rather die," Lily said, her voice trembling, but her chin held high. "Then die elsewhere," the stepmother sneered. "I'll take Grandpa's land," Lily countered, playing her only card. "The deed in Wyoming." Her stepmother laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Dead rock land? Nothing grows there but misery. But if you want to trade a warm bed for a grave, be my guest." The departure was swift. Lily packed her meager belongings into a worn satchel. Her father, a man hollowed out by whiskey and regret, sat in the corner, unable to meet her gaze. He was a shadow of the man he once was, his spine bent under the weight of his wife's scorn. But as Lily stepped onto the porch, the floorboards creaking under her boots, she felt a rough hand grab her wrist. It was him. He didn't speak at first. He looked around nervously, then jammed a wad of crumpled bills into her palm. $50. It was a fortune, likely every cent he had skimmed and hidden away over a lifetime of labor. "Don't look at me," he choked out, the smell of cheap liquor on his breath. Tears welled in his red-rimmed eyes. "Don't you dare come back here, Lily. You go out there and you survive." It was the most courage he had shown in years. Lily swallowed the lump in her throat. She gripped the money tight, feeling the texture of her freedom. She climbed onto the wagon headed west, the canvas flapping in the wind. As the wheels kicked up dust, blurring the silhouette of her childhood home, she didn't wave. She simply turned her face toward the horizon, leaving the bitterness of Kansas in the dirt behind her. Medicine Bow Valley didn't welcome Lily. It dared her to step off the wagon. When she finally stood on the 160 acres her grandfather had left her, the wind tore at her dress like a wild animal. The locals hadn't lied. This wasn't farmland. It was a graveyard of limestone and sagebrush under the shadow of Elk Mountain. There was no majestic homestead waiting for her. Only a collapsed shack, its timber gray and rotting, looking more like a pile of driftwood than a shelter. Thomas Garrett, a neighbor with skin like cured leather and a wad of chewing tobacco tucked permanently in his cheek, rode by on a roan mare. He didn't dismount. He just looked down at the scrawny 16-year-old girl standing amidst the rubble. "You the heiress?" Garrett asked, his voice dripping with amusement. He spat a stream of brown juice onto the dry earth. "I give you 3 weeks, little lady. The boys down at the saloon already got a pool going. Smart money says you freeze or run back to Kansas before the first snow hits in November." He tipped his hat, a gesture of mockery, not respect, and rode off, leaving Lily alone in the vast, crushing silence. Panic clawed at her throat. She walked over to a fallen log, part of the old structure, and tried to heave it. It barely budged. Her muscles burned, and her hands, still soft from indoor chores, stung. In that moment, the sheer physical impossibility of her situation hit her. To build a standard log cabin, she would need to fell trees, notch timber, and hoist heavy beams. She didn't have the brawn. She was a girl of 16, not a lumberjack. She sat on the cold stone, defeated, burying her face in her hands. But in the darkness behind her eyelids, a memory sparked. She saw her grandfather. Not the frail old man who had died, but the sharp-eyed teacher from her childhood summers. He had never forced a needle and thread into her hands. Instead, he had pointed to the fulcrum of a wagon jack. "Listen to me, Lily." His voice echoed in her mind. "You ain't built like an ox, so don't try to pull like one. Men use muscle because it's cheap. You use your head. That's expensive." He had taught her about leverage and heat. "The earth holds heat better than wood," he had said once, tapping his temple. "And gravity is the only worker that never sleeps." Lily lifted her head. She wiped the dust from her cheeks and looked at the landscape with new eyes. She stopped looking at the distant pine trees she couldn't cut down. Instead, she looked at the ground. She looked at the south-facing slope of a small hillock nearby. Garrett and the others expected her to build up, fighting the wind. But she realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that she wasn't going to fight the wind at all. She couldn't build a cabin like a man. So, she wouldn't. She stood up, ignoring the blisters forming on her palms. She walked past the rotting timber and drove her shovel into the side of the hill. The earth was hard, but it yielded. $50 could have bought a train ticket back to civilization. It could have bought enough silk and lace to catch a husband in Cheyenne. Instead, Lily walked into the general store in Carbon and bought a war chest. The storekeep, a man with ink-stained fingers and a skeptical squint, read her list aloud. A crowbar, a 10-pound sledge, a sack of quicklime, and, blasting powder? He looked up, peering over his spectacles. "You fixing to mine for gold, girl?" "I'm fixing to live," Lily replied flatly. She spent every last cent. She didn't buy sugar or coffee. She bought an obstinate, sway-backed mule named Barnaby for $12, a block and tackle system, and the tools of a navvy. Back at the claim, under the relentless glare of the summer sun, Lily began her work. She didn't try to build a cabin that would stand tall against the wind. She decided to become part of the earth. She chose a steep bank on the south side of the hill. Her grandfather's voice was a constant hum in her mind. "The sun is your furnace." By digging into the south slope, she ensured that the low arc of the winter sun would flood her home with light and warmth. while the earth above would shield her from the northerly blizzards. She dug until her hands were raw and blistered. Then she wrapped them in rags and dug some more. She carved a room 12 feet deep into the hillside. It wasn't just a hole. It was a sanctuary of thermodynamics. At 4 feet down, the earth maintained a constant temperature, roughly 50 to 55 degrees, regardless of whether the air outside was boiling or freezing. She wasn't building a house. She was building a root cellar for a human being. But the geology of Wyoming fights back. In late July, her shovel hit a limestone boulder the size of a carriage, blocking her entryway. It was immovable. A man like Garrett would have cursed and moved the build site. Lily wiped the sweat from her eyes and looked at the rock. She weighed 110 pounds, soaking wet. The rock weighed at least 1,000. It was impossible math, unless you changed the equation. She rigged her block and tackled to a sturdy pine stump uphill. She wedged the iron crowbar under the boulder, creating a fulcrum with a smaller stone. It was pure physics. Force times distance equals force times distance. By lengthening the lever arm, she amplified her strength. She hitched Barnaby to the rope system. "Pull!" she commanded, clicking her tongue. The ropes groaned, stretching tight. The wooden pulley blocks creaked under the tension. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding sound that vibrated through the soles of her boots, the massive boulder shifted. It rolled aside, defeated not by muscle, but by geometry. Standing in the dust, watching that rock yield, Lily felt a surge of power she had never known. She had traded her father's $50 for the only currency that mattered out here: capability. By September, the dugout was framed with scavenged timber, and the front wall was rising, stone by stone, mortared with the lime she'd hauled in. The wind began to bite harder at night, whispering of the winter to come, but Lily was no longer just a girl on a rock. She was an engineer. January 1875 brought a reckoning to the Wyoming Territory. It wasn't just a winter storm. It was the White Death. The temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The wind screamed down the valley like a banshee, tearing shingles off the sturdy frame houses in town and turning cattle into frozen statues where they stood. The proud, tall cabins that men like Thomas Garrett had built, jutting arrogantly into the sky, were now groaning under the assault, their thin wood walls offering little more protection than paper against the gale. But deep in the southern slope of the hill, the wind simply slid over Lily's roof. It was near dusk when a desperate pounding shook her heavy oak door. Lily set down her book, picked up her shotgun, and lifted the latch. A cluster of men tumbled in, encased in ice, coughing and gasping. Leading them, supported by 2 ranch hands, was Silas Vance. The wealthy horsebreaker looked nothing like the terror of Kansas now. His face was gray with hypothermia, his eyebrows frosted white. They had been moving a herd when the blizzard blinded them, overturning their wagon and leaving them to die in the drifts. "Fire!" Silas stammered, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. "Girl, build up the fire." But as the men collapsed onto the dirt floor, they stopped shivering. They looked around, bewildered. The fire in Lily's hearth was small, just a modest pile of coals. Yet the air inside the dugout was thick with warmth. It wasn't the scorching, uneven heat of a drafty cabin. It was a heavy, enveloping embrace. Outside, the heavy layer of snow blanketing Lily's sod roof acted as a perfect insulator, trapping the heat inside. The dugout didn't fight the cold. It wore the winter like a coat. Silas peeled off his frozen gloves, staring at the stone walls. They were warm to the touch. "How?" he rasped, looking at the 16-year-old he had tried to purchase. "My house. The wind blows right through the floorboards. It's freezing in here." "But it ain't. Stone holds memory, Mr. Vance," Lily said quietly, returning to her chair. She gestured to the walls. "I fired the stove all day yesterday. The earth absorbed it. Now, the earth is giving it back. It was the principle of thermal mass." While the men of the valley burned cords of wood trying to heat the leaking air of their cabins, Lily had heated the mountain itself. She poured a cup of hot water from the kettle and slid it across the table to Silas. He took it with trembling hands. He looked at the girl, then at the sturdy, low beams, and finally at the walls that hummed with stored heat. He realized then that the $50 her father had given her, the price of a cheap horse or a very short reprieve, had been transmuted. She hadn't bought luxuries. She had bought physics. Lily didn't gloat. She simply turned the page of her book, the firelight dancing in her eyes. Outside, the wind howled for blood, but in the belly of the hill, the girl who was supposed to die was the only one keeping the Winter Kings alive. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1875, the landscape of Medicine Bow looked different. The storm had stripped away the pretensions of the valley. Many of the stick-frame shanties were kindling, but on the south slope of the hill, green grass was already sprouting on Lily Harper's roof. Silas Vance returned a week after the thaw. He didn't come with threats or a whip this time. He came with a bank draft. He stood before the dugout, humbled, and offered Lily $5,000 for the deed, 100 times the $50 she had started with. He wanted the design. He wanted the safety she had engineered. Lily wiped her hands on her apron, looking out over the valley where the wildflowers were pushing through the limestone. "No," she said, her voice steady as the mountain itself. "It's a fortune, girl," Silas pressed. "You could live like a queen in St. Louis." "I don't want to be a queen," Lily replied. "I want to be free. This is the only place on God's earth where no one can ever tell me to leave." News of the girl in the hill traveled fast, riding the rails all the way back to Kansas. It reached a dimly lit farmhouse where a broken man finally found his spine. Lily's father, hearing of his daughter's triumph, poured his whiskey down the drain. He packed his bags, ignored his wife screaming, and walked out the door. He walked all the way to Wyoming. He didn't come to save her. He knew now that she didn't need saving. He came to work for her. Lily Harper didn't just survive the winter. She conquered it. She proved that while muscles can build a house, it takes grit and physics to build a fortress. She turned $50 and a pile of dirt into a legacy of independence. Question for you. When life gives you a pile of rocks and a cold wind, do you complain about the weather, or do you start building a shelter? Outro. If Lily's story reminded you that your starting point doesn't determine your finish line, and that true strength comes from the mind, not just the hands, hit that subscribe button. Join us at Warm Heart Stories for more tales of resilience, courage, and the human spirit.